Hello, my name is Leonard Sultana from An Englishman in San Diego, and this is another in a series of our interviews titled Icons of Con. Now, that might seem like a very grand title, but the subjects that we talk to are industry insiders, Comic-Con commentators, and pop culture celebrities who return each year to San Diego, not only as invited guests, but also as dedicated fans, just like us. Now, after our first interview subject, journalist, writer, and con panel host Geoff Boucher joined us, he had such a great time that he recommended a number of his friends to talk to me, including this episode's guest, lifelong comics fan, the modern era movies of Batman executive producer, and long-time Comic-Con attendee, Michael Uslan. Now, two things frustrated me about this interview. One, we usually run them as Google Hangouts, which does allow me to see the subjects' faces and see how animated Michael got with this interview. It would have been lovely to have seen him on the screen. However, time constraints and technical limitations on Michael's part meant that this took place as a transatlantic phone interview. Secondly, the job that pays the bills when this interview took place is I work as a DJ on an evening, and when Michael was free to do this, it was late afternoon GMT and only left me 20 or so minutes to talk to him. Now, as it happens, I gladly ran late for that evening's gig as the time just flew by, listening to Michael's stories of the first Comic-Cons on the planet, meeting his personal heroes, and eventually bringing his Batman to the big screen, to San Diego for the first time. Speaking to Michael Uslan, this is Icons of Con. Too much of your time. I'd love to know what Geoff said to convince you to do this for me.
When Geoff Boucher asks a favor, you immediately say yes.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Brilliant. Okay, well, let me just explain what the idea of the conversation is. It's for a series of interviews I'm running called Icons of Con, which I know is a very grandiose title, but it's about the people that go to con and are recognised as the faces of Comic-Con, especially San Diego. I know that this year is a very big year for yourself and for Batman, especially at con this year. So it's about your history with Comic-Con and from your first visits to the con up to kind of present day. Because Michael, Geoff told me that did you go to like the first Comic-Con or one of the first San Diego Comic-Cons?
No, the actual first comic book convention ever held in the world.
Wow.
It was in New York City, in a Fleabag hotel in July of 1964. 200 of us showed up at the first Comic-Con.
Wow.
So if you'd like me to start there, I can kind of take you back in time and and tell that story.
Well, tell you what, I mean, for those listening who don't know who you are, who is Michael? Is it Uslan, by the way? How do you pronounce his surname?
It's pronounced Uslan.
Uslan. Excellent.
Yes.
Okay. So, who is Michael Uslan, and how does it describe you on your passport? Just how...
Nice guy. A comic book fanboy, geek since he could learn to read from the comics. Avid comic book collector growing up with a absolute humongous comic book collection dating back to 1936, of which, as of now, 45,000 of them have been donated to Indiana University's Lilly Library, which is its rare book library. I was the self-described boy who loved Batman when I was growing up. I discovered Batman at age 5. It was too scary for me. I stayed with Superman until I was a much more mature and sophisticated 8 years old. And then I was willing to move into the arena of Batman and became a lifelong Bat fan from that moment on. But I loved all comic books, all superheroes, or Western humor, science fiction, fantasy, romance. Every genre that existed in comics I collected.
Wow, so I mean it was all genres then?
All genres. I loved the medium of comics.
Now, well...
Yes.
Well, I mean, a lot of... I find when I talk to comic book fans that they either... Well, they really enjoy the format and enjoy the styles and enjoy the method of storytelling that comic books present. But then there's also the comic book fans that look into the small box in the bottom left-hand corner and see who wrote and drew these stories. Were you someone who studied that from a very early age, or was that something that kind of developed later on?
What you have to know in the context of the time is that when I started reading comic books in the 1950s and into the beginning of the 60s, comic book credits were not given. You did not have those boxes. You did not know who the artists were or the writers were or the editors were, except in rare occasions. So I did come to know, hey, look at this issue. That's the good Batman artist. That's the not-so-good Batman artist. Isn't it funny that they're both listed as Bob Kane? Gee, I guess some days he has his talent really going well, and other days he doesn't seem to. I had no idea. There were different artists. There were ghost artists drawing the same characters. So when I grew up, it was definitely about the medium itself. It was the graphic storytelling. You have to understand, when I was growing up in the 50s and early 60s, movies and TV, to see adventure fantasy movies and Superman on TV, it was really pretty cheesy. The world of special effects was nowhere like the way it has become since the dawning of the computer age. The advantage with comic books was they were frozen movies. They could transport me away and entertain me, and I would escape from the daily traumas of grade school, and I would go off to foreign planets and undersea and strange lands and back in time or to the future in the pages of comic books. But the drawings were so captivating in terms of my imagination in a way that many movies of the day were unable to do. So for 10 cents and later 12 cents, it was a bargain for me to be transported like that. Comic books were my real escape as I was growing up.
Sure. So when you did start recognizing the good Batmans from the bad Batmans, and you started recognizing the artists, is that when you started going to comic conventions?
Yes. Around about the time I was 13 years old, this new thing had started called comic book fandom. And it was organized primarily by Dr. Jerry Bales, who was a professor at Wayne State University in Michigan, and then Roy Thomas, who went on to become a very, very famous comic book writer and editor, and publisher of Alter Ego, the fan magazine, the fanzine. And fandom began to unite. And again, in the context of the time, there was no internet. There were no Comic-Cons. So the only way we were able to communicate with each other was due to the good graces of a few editors in the world of comic books like Julie Schwartz at DC Comics. In the letter columns that they published in the DC Comics that Schwartz edited, he would put people's full addresses.
Wow.
We could begin to write to each other, because when I was growing up, really up until the time I was about 13, I was convinced that me and my friend Bobby Klein were the only two kids in the world that were so into comic books and superheroes. I had no idea there was anyone else like us out there. So So that was a critical moment. And as fandom began to organize, that's what led to the first comic book convention, which was really the work of two individuals, a gentleman named Bernie Bubness in New York, and another gentleman, David Kaler, and they came up with this idea, and Bernie Bubness ran that first con, and it was in a Fleabag hotel downtown in New York, and they sent out through these early primitive fanzines that were on mimeograph paper and stapled together, and had print runs ranging from 100 to maybe 600 fans. And the word began to spread that there was going to be a convention of comic book fans in New York. Well, 200 of us showed up that weekend, and I had to really try hard to convince my mom and dad to drive me and my friend Bobby there and to spend the weekend in New York while we went to this convention. And then when we got to the hotel, and we literally had to step over a guy passed out drunk in the lobby, there were roaches on the walls, and my mother took one look around and she said, "We are out of here." And I then had to appeal to my Supreme Court, which was my dad. And my dad was great. He kind of talked my mom down and said, "This will be a great adventure, and it'll be crazy, it'll be fun." And finally, she agreed to stay. And as Bobby and I then ran upstairs to go to the first Comic-Con, her parting words to us were, "Don't touch anything." And that was the beginning of the first Comic-Con.
Because in reading about the earlier cons, I've kind of also been reading that the artists were invited along to those early cons, not too sure what to expect with the fans, and pretty much they showed up and were very blown away by the enthusiasm of the fans, and they all kind of spread the word amongst themselves. So the artists and the creators of comics also helped with conventions and fandom getting underway, because they were as enthusiastic as the fans were.
Well, it's true, but in the beginning it was even more extreme than that. In the beginning, we couldn't get hardly anyone from the comic book companies to attend the convention.
Oh, right.
They were frightened. They were actually put off. They said, "Now, wait a minute. What kind of human being, as an adult, is interested in comic books and collecting comic books when the comic books we make are supposedly for 8 to 12-year-old boys? How could there be this interest? These people must be degenerates or perverts or God knows what they are, but they've got to be really strange." So most of the companies and the people did not go. Stan didn't go. Stan Lee at Marvel sent his secretary, Lo Steinberg, to check the place out. From DC Comics, there were only a couple of people who showed up. Two great writers, Otto Binder, who was one of my mentors, whom I had interviewed for these fanzines, because starting at age 13, I began writing for the fanzines, because I lived in New Jersey, and I was within striking distance of New York City. So all of the creators, the artists and writers from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s lived in and around New York, in New Jersey or Long Island. So I was able to go visit them at their homes and interview them personally and get all these great first-hand stories of how the comic book industry started, how the first superheroes were created, how the comic book companies began. And that was a wonderful thing. And all the comic book companies back then were located in New York, so I would visit each comic book company, and I would meet the people there, I would do interviews, I would go on tours when they had them, and that was a magical thing as a kid. So by the time the conventions rolled around, Otto Binder, who was at that time writing Superman, Otto had co-created Supergirl, the Legion of Superheroes, Brainiac, and so many great characters. He had been the driving force of Captain Marvel and the Marvel family in the 1940s to early 50s. Bill Finger, who we know today as the co-creator of Batman, but back then nobody really knew too much about Bill and what he did. They knew he wrote Batman, and he wrote some Black Hawk, and he wrote all kinds of different things. But Bill was one of the few brave enough to show up, and it was very, very much hit and miss. One other thing that I would add, and this is with the credit going to Bernie and to David and those guys, the question began, with how do 200 people sanely talk about and discuss comic books. How do you do that? And they said, well, let's just put up a dais, and we'll put up a table, and we'll put up some chairs, and we'll do it in the form of panels.
Pretty much creating the format that we know today.
Yeah, it's the heart and soul of how Comic Cons are still done today.
Sure.
Then they had the first ever auction of comic books that weekend. Dr. Jerry Bales auctioned off some of his own personal copies from the Golden Age, and it was unbelievable. The first issue of Action Comics that introduced Superman was auctioned off for the unheard of price of $40.
Whoa.
You might note that it recently went for over $3 million.
Yes.
Batman #1, I bid on it. I bid $27 for it, and the darn thing sold for $29. So I just missed out on that when I was 13. So that took place. They decided to show old movie serials and cartoons at night. And the question began as, what are we going to do on Saturday night? Of the 200 people here, it's like 197 men and 3 women. What are we going to do? And that's when, between Bernie and David, they said, well, how about if we just tell everyone to come dressed up as their favorite superhero and we'll give out prizes for their costumes? And that was the night that cosplay was born.
Well, that was going to be a question I was going to ask a little bit later on, because obviously you started going to these cons when you were young. Have you ever cosplayed?
Oh, of course. At that first Comic-Con, my mom helped me make my costume. I went as the 1940 Sandman from DC Comics, the guy with the fedora and the gas mask.
Yeah.
And there was a magazine published at the time called Castle of Frankenstein magazine. And in the magazine, somebody took a picture of me shooting Spider-Man, who was hanging from the pipe downstairs in the basement of the Broadway Central Hotel. And we made it into the magazine. And that's a picture in my autobiography, which was published last year by Chronicle Books. It's called The Boy Who Loved Batman. I actually reproduced that picture of me from 7th grade with me dressed up as the Sandman from the first Comic-Con.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. Okay, so that's when cons get started, but I think for very much contemporary con goers, the biggest and most epic one is the one that, I mean, as a Brit coming to North America, we come for San Diego Comic-Con. So when did you...
Since the mid-'70s.
Okay.
Before then, it was all New York. New York dominated. It was the New York Con. There was a Detroit Triple Fanfare that was one of the early Comic-Cons. But it was New York. And Phil Suling took over the New York Comic-Con, and he grew it. He really was the guy who expanded it, who was able to get the talent, the editors, the writers, the artists, the creators, to get the comic book companies themselves to support comic book fandom and the convention. And he was the one that appealed to people like Will Eisner and Milton Caniff and Jack Kirby and Stan Lee to come out and be guests of honor and speak and be accessible to the fans. And so Phil Suling deserves enormous critical credit for having legitimized Comic-Cons and grown it to the point where it was then able to transition to San Diego. One of the big problems in New York by the mid-'70s, everyone was complaining how expensive it was to mount a convention in New York City, to advertise and promote it in New York City. And you might recall at that time in the 70s, New York City was having more than its share of economic problems.
Indeed.
The city was in the process of going bankrupt. So the transition happened to San Diego, and that was a milestone. Today, San Diego, as you well know, pretty much sells out of its tickets within 24 hours. They have a capacity limit of somewhere around 125 or 35,000. I think it's 135,000.
Sure, yeah.
And that's gone in a blink of an eye. And then you get to see fans literally invade and take over the entire downtown of a major city. And if you've never seen it, if you've never experienced it, I would say go for it. It is
Well,
an amazing spectacle.
2015 will be my fifth. The 2010,
2000,
2010 was my first San Diego Comic Con.
well, if you want to really be stunned, this summer's San Diego Comic-Con will be my 50th. Between New York and San Diego.
Wow. Did you go to one of the first San Diego ones, or had it been running for a couple of years at that point?
No, I did not go to the early San Diego cons because I was in school in Indiana at that time.
Yeah.
And I was trying to pay for my schooling, and there was no way, unless I wanted to hitchhike with my wife, there was no way I was going to be able to get to San Diego in those first years.
When was your first San Diego Comic Con?
My first San Diego Comic Con must have been round about 1980. Let's see. In 1980, we announced our first Batman movie at New York Comic Con. So I'm guessing my first San Diego was probably 81.
Right. It moved down to the convention center at that point, yeah.
Yeah. My first ones were when it first moved to the convention center.
Right.
So you'd have to check me on the date.
Sure.
Because I'm really fuzzy on that. But that's when that happened. An interesting note in mentioning the 1980 Comic Con is that my partner Ben Melniker and I had acquired the rights to Batman from DC Comics to make it to movies on October 3rd, 1979. And then we set it up with a film company to finance the development of the movie, and we were ready to announce the movie to the world. And in meeting with the studio people, I went out on a limb, and I must have been such a pain in the butt to a lot of people, insisting that we break the announcement at New York Comic Con in July of '80. And they thought I was crazy out of my mind. They said, this is going to be a major movie. Whoever heard of breaking the news at a silly comic book convention? We have major publicity in the New York Times and in these magazines and TV. I go, no, you don't understand. I said, it's got to be at the Comic-Con. So finally, after much haranguing, they allowed me to do it, and they gave us a little money to do it, and we worked in conjunction with DC Comics. So in July 1980, we had a press conference, an announcement to a packed house at it was at that time the Statler Hilton Hotel in New York City, across from Penn Station. It's now the Hotel Pennsylvania. And we had the bat signal shining on the Empire State Building. And we had a cocktail party along with it. And that's where we announced the Batman movie. And that was the first time in history a major motion picture was announced at a comic book convention.
Wow. Well, that's kind of taking me back to when I know I may seem like I'm going backwards and forwards in time here, but I'm trying to get that certainly that period before you started with Batman on a professional level, because you've obviously turned your enthusiasms and passions from your childhood into a career. I mean, when did it first feel that you were attending cons, not so much as a fan, but as a job, as it were?
That would have been the 1980 convention.
Yeah.
When we made the announcement there, because I'm a fanboy, and I've been going to the cons every year. Now all of a sudden, I was speaking at one, and making a major announcement, and responsible for a function at one, and that changed everything. But of course, I've never lost the fact that I wear multiple hats, and there's my producer hat, but there's also my comic book fan hat and my comic book historian hat. And, I still absolutely love it. Recently, I spoke at a major university here, and during Q&A, a young lady said to me, well, Mr. Uslan, what exactly is your job? And I thought about it for a second, and I laughed. I said, well, really? Every day I report to a sandbox and play with my favorite toys. That's what I do for a living. So the transition has been great. I found a way to take my passion in life, which is comic books and Batman, and make it into my work, and life doesn't get any sweeter than that.
When you, because obviously when you say you brought the movie announcement to San Diego Comic Con in 1980, before that, What was the perception of Batman at that point? Was it still considered quite campy, or was there like a hardened comic book fan at the convention that remembered the Bob Kanes and remembered the Bill Fingers and kind of were almost swimming against the tide of the fandom that remembered the TV show?
Yeah, most of comic book fandom at that time were people who loved Batman as created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger and added to by Jerry Robinson,
Sure.
starting in 1939, which was Batman as a creature of the night who stalks criminals from the shadows, with some very scary villains. And when the Batman TV show debuted, I mean, I was so excited. I had been waiting months and months for this to happen. I couldn't have been more excited. And when it came on the air that night, and I think I was in, 8th or ninth grade, I was simultaneously thrilled and horrified by what I was seeing on TV. I mean, I was thrilled that it was in color. Clearly, they were spending a lot of money on the sets. The opening animation looked great. The car was cool. But then it hit me that they had made Batman into a joke, and it was a comedy, and people around the world were laughing at Batman, and that just killed me.
Wow.
And it was that night, in fact, that I probably made what I would call my own young Bruce Wayne vow. And watching that show, I thought, somehow, some way, I am going to show the world what the real Batman is like, the one created in 1939, the creature of the night, and find a way to erase from the collective consciousness of the world culture those three little words, pow, zap, and wham. So it was really that night that set me on a path that would ultimately define my career and guide the rest of my life.
Well, I mean, that's a mission
So it
statement.
was
That's a mission statement.
yeah.
Fantastic. When you go to cons nowadays, obviously you are a big part in what Batman is perceived today. Do you get recognised at cons? Can you walk freely around the exhibition floor, for example?
Well, it's funny. What's taken place now, which my wife is not really pleased with, is I'm getting recognized in the street.
Wow.
It has happened so many times now in New York City. Getting on an elevator, going into a Starbucks, walking through security at an airport where the guy checking security asks me for an autograph. I mean, it's just gotten strange. And the reason for that, really, is I have done so many DVD bonus features and extras and documentaries over the years that have been disseminated, like along with our Batman DVDs and our animated DVDs and things. So people, fans have come to recognize me for that. Walking around cons, it's great. It's great because I get stopped, every 25 or 50 paces by somebody, and I get into great conversations, or we do pictures, or I sign something for them. But I'm a fan at heart, and I enjoy meeting them, and because I am one of them still, and I think it's great, and I really do enjoy it, and I love the fans.
Excellent. When you say that your wife gets a little bit frustrated sometimes, does she come to the cons with you?
She finally broke down and went with me and my son to San Diego Comic-Con for the first time a couple of years ago. And I think it was when we had a big Batman thing. Oh, I remember. It was when we had all the Batmobiles.
2 years ago, yes.
Starting from the TV show to all the movies. And let me tell you, when we put all those Batmobiles together at one place at one time at San Diego Comic-Con, you would think the Beatles had arrived. The cars were superstars. And it was that evening in Big Hall H where we premiered the Batmobile documentary. So she came to that one and was able to, get into the tumbler and do some fun things with the car. But she was absolutely overwhelmed by the sensory overload of San Diego Comic-Con, and if you've been there, you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yes.
The second you walk into the room, I don't care what lane, what aisle, or where, there is so much bombarding you in terms of visuals and sounds that it's like a horse that wears blinders. If you don't put blinders on and just focus on one thing here and then move your head to the next thing over there and then move up and down or side to side, if you don't do it slowly, you're just completely overwhelmed and blown away in a good way. So she did that for about 10 or 15 minutes and said, okay, I'm going back to the hotel. I will see you later.
Well, I mean, that was certainly one of the epic memories of recent Comic-Con with those Batmobiles outside the Hilton Bayfront. That was just an amazing moment. Is it true that the Batmobiles are going to be making a return for the 75th? I know that you may not want to reveal too much about plans
I always let the studio announce anything publicity-wise on its own. They love to control that and direct it the way they like. So I bow to them to reveal what they're going to reveal when they want to reveal it.
Sure. I mean, where were you when the announcement was made about the Man of Steel sequel, the Batman versus Superman film in Hall H? Where were you when that news dropped? Were you in the room?
I was in the process of getting bombarded by emails and Facebook postings and messages and voicemails from, I think, everyone I've ever known and probably 2/3 of all of comic book fandom. But, it was something that, I go back and think about the history of it. It was a similar reaction when Michael Keaton was first announced as to play Bruce Wayne or Batman in the first movie, which I can't believe is now 25 years ago.
Yeah.
So, and by the way, footnote, this year we are celebrating what I call the 175-50-25 anniversary of Batman, because it's the 25th anniversary of our first Batman movie from 1989.
Sure.
It's the 50th anniversary of the new look Batman with the yellow symbol around him that Julie Schwartz instituted in Detective Comics 327 in 1964. It is the 75th anniversary of Batman from 1939, and it is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Bill Finger.
Oh, wow.
It's really an incredible year, and in fact, I've written a piece on this for the San Diego Comic-Con official booklet that will be distributed this year.
For the souvenir book. Oh, brilliant. And
so, I mean, that was fun.
Oh, I certainly look forward to reading that. Oh, that's brilliant.
So we went through this with Michael Keaton, and then the fans that, were ready to attack with pitchforks and torches when that news came out, ultimately after seeing the film and seeing him in the film, never wanted anyone else to ever play Batman. When Heath Ledger was announced as the Joker, there was a similar outcry. Fans said, how can a guy who just played a gay cowboy in Brokeback Mountain play the Joker? It's going to destroy the character forever. And now, as far as most of those fans are concerned, they acknowledge it's the performance of a lifetime. It is one of the most incredible performances ever in film. And they really don't want to see anyone else ever play the Joker. So, we've been around this before, and I couldn't be more enthused, more thrilled.
Well, you brought the first Tim Burton film to Comic-Con. Did you ever have hopes for the Nolan films to be brought to Con? Because rather famously, Christopher Nolan never brought any of his Batman trilogy to San Diego.
First of all, you know how fortunate you have to be to work in your life and be involved in something with a guy who's a genius?
Absolutely.
I can sit back now after all these decades in the business and say, oh my God, I've really been involved with 3 geniuses along the way. Young Tim Burton, my dear friend who's no longer with us, Anton Furst, who was our production designer on the first Batman movie.
Wondering who your third was going to be, yeah.
Anton, he won the Oscar that year for his work. He created Gotham City, the Batmobile, the look of the whole thing. And if you just step back for a second, I 1989 Batman movie, virtually every genre film since then has been influenced by that movie and those two gentlemen. You can still, to this day, in all these different movies that come out within a genre, you can still see Tim Burton's vision. You can still see the influence of Anton Furst's designs, and you can in fact still hear the influence of Danny Elfman's music. It really was that revolutionary. And then, 15, 20 years later, when Christopher Nolan comes in, Chris deserves all the accolades and all the credit for the Dark Knight trilogy. Here was a man who was able to restore the darkness and dignity to Batman again, and did it in a way whereby he elevated the art form. But when you walk out of one of Chris's Batman movies, you don't have to say, geez, that was a great comic book movie. You can say, that was a great film.
Yeah.
And Chris did that. And he is passionate and loves and knows these characters. And the fans respect that. They know he's got that love and passion and knowledge base. So whether, in terms of marketing, a movie is first or second or third or fourth screened at San Diego or New York or Chicago Comic-Con or elsewhere, they know, the fans respect him because they know he respects the integrity of Batman.
Sure.
And that's what's essential.
I often look at the history of the films very much following the template of the comic books. So the 1989 Batman, very much looking back at the Bob Kane, Bill Finger era, the Joel Schumacher slightly campier version, covering very much that 60s, like you say, the pow wham era. And then you had the Christopher Nolan films, very much looking at, say, The Dark Knight Returns, taking those two templates side by side. It's almost like they mirror each other in that there's very much an evolution of tone. I always felt, which kind of makes now Batman open game, because now the templates have reached the nadir. They're in 2015, 2014 and 2015, it's now a whole new ball game, as it were.
It's true. Yeah, this is a character, if you just look in the comics, let's forget about the animation, which is brilliant, by the way.
Yeah.
Let's forget about the movies. Let's just talk about the comics. Over the decades, there have been so many different iterations of Batman, in the writing, as well as in the artwork, in the design, in the tone, ranging from one extreme to the other. I can show you issues of Bat Genie and the Batman robot and the Super Batman from Planet X. I can show you Bat Baby. But then on the other hand, I can show you issues of Batman that are darn close to Dracula in terms of almost vampiric. They are so dark and cold. And you've got everything in between. So over 75 years, any filmmaker or animator or writer has so many choices to be made. And the question becomes, well, which is the true Batman? Well, in actuality, I mean, if you ask me, being the fanboy I was and coming up the way I did, my true Batman was the Batman of 39, created by Bob and Bill, and then expanded by Jerry with like Batman #1 that introduced the Joker and the Catwoman, and then the introduction of the Scarecrow in World's Finest Comics. But for most people, their true Batman is the one that they were first exposed to maybe when they were 12 years old. And that's why he continually is able to morph. And he represents many different things to many different people. And that's one of the magical things that has made Batman last so long. Very, very few superhero characters can do that.
Sure. Stepping away from Batman, just for a little while, just for a second, because you have had a varied career yourself, that you've been involved in quite a few characters as a producer, We've actually had a question from one of our readers about the Shadow, and knowing that there was the possibility of a Shadow film with Sam Raimi. Is that possible that may still happen?
That movie is no longer in development.
Yeah.
I'm sad to say. Sam, he's an amazing and talented director, and he is a huge Shadow fan. He became a Shadow fan when he was a kid, and it was the 1970s DC comic book run of the Shadow that really got him hooked into comics, as well as to the Shadow. Early in his career, when he was unable to get the rights to the Shadow, he went ahead and made Darkman, which was really his homage to the Shadow. I love this character so much. This character was the absolute direct inspiration for Batman, and Bill Finger has admitted it. You could read his quotes. What we didn't know when Bill said how he was directly inspired by and influenced by the Shadow was that he actually directly borrowed from the November 1936 Shadow pulp the story that he then made into the Case of the Chemical Syndicate in Detective Comics number 27, and the spot illustrations in that particular Shadow pulp novel were borrowed directly by Bob Kane in rendering some of the artwork in that issue. So there's the direct correlation. I knew the creative force behind the Shadow, Walter Gibson. I worked with Walter in the 80s, and I had a chance to ask him probably a million annoying questions. I wanted to know everything from his lips about the Shadow and his origin and the Girasol ring and the villains, and it was quite wonderful for me. And now I've been lucky enough that in the 1970s I had the opportunity to write part of the Shadow series at DC, and I did at that time write the first and only crossover between the Shadow and the Avenger, two great pulp characters. More recently, through Dynamite Comics, I have a graphic novel that just came out last month, which is the first ever meeting of the Shadow and the Green Hornet, and it's the Shadow Green Hornet Dark Knights. And the last thing I will say is tomorrow at WonderCon in Anaheim, there's going to be an announcement made about my next graphic novel, and I can't say too much about it, but since you're asking about the Shadow,
sure,
I can tell you it's going to be something very special.
Brilliant. So there you go, Matthew Smith. There's your question about the Shadow film. May not be the answer that you were after. Actually, let's go to a couple of questions that we've had submitted to put to you, because obviously a lot of people really excited about this year, about Batman 75. And you've already said that you'd prefer to let DC make any announcements. If there is a Batman 75 panel at Comic-Con, would you like to be on that panel? I think if there's a space that you should be there.
Well, I appreciate that very much. Right now, I'm going to be appearing with Kevin Smith and a few people at the Paley Center in New York for the New York 75th anniversary celebration of Batman on, I believe it is May 5th. May 5th at 5:30 at the Paley Center in New York. Then I'm going to hop on a plane, and I'm going to go to L.A. and work with Geoff Boucher on Batman's 75th anniversary at the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood, and that we're doing Saturday night, May 10th in L.A. So, the celebrations continue. There will be many celebrations in many places. And with San Diego, as I mentioned, I have written for their booklet the piece on the 75th anniversary of Batman as well. So I'm as excited as the 8-year-old fanboy I was.
So there you go, Jason Nieves. Hopefully we'll be seeing Michael at a panel in San Diego. What's been your personal experience with Comic-Con, with the shows that you've been involved with? What's been your favourite memory that has stuck out when you've gone to Comic-Con, would you say?
Wow.
I know. It's a big question.
That is a huge question. I don't know how to boil it down. It's the whole overall encompassing experience, knowing that that entire town has been taken over by comic fans. That when you go to a restaurant that's jammed in San Diego, you know that virtually everybody at that restaurant is a comic book freak. When you go out to the bars and you know everybody sitting there is into comics, at the hotels, walking through the streets day or night, it's that feeling. Because let me tell you, when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, believe me, it was not cool to be over the age of 12 and still known to be collecting and reading comic books. People stared at you like you were an oddball. And I'll tell you something else. When I was in high school, age 17 and 18, and the girls, would hear that I still collected comic books, I became what I would call date challenged. So now, to think that with the beginning of the blockbuster movies, that comic books are seeding these blockbuster films, comic books are providing hit television series, great heralded animation, acclaimed video games. It's impacting merchandising everywhere. It's influencing fashion and eyewear and everything you can imagine. Comic book original artwork by artists who had for so long been looked down the nose at by society and the artistic world in New York or London. Now their works are hanging in galleries. They're hanging in museums. It's a wonderful thing. So my point here is, after all of this, speaking to all my fellow comic book nerds and geeks, we win.
Well, yes.
We win. It's a great victory for us because now it's all cool. It's all hip, and it is all accepted as a legitimate art form.
Well, I personally look at the term popular arts and say, well, yes, we're popular now. It's right there in the title. We did kind of win. Okay, a couple more questions. Certainly one more question from one of our readers. Neil Williamson has asked, when you do go to cons, what do you personally target as your priorities at a con? Are there specific panels or the exhibition floor? Or do you even make your way into somewhere like Hall H or Ballroom 20? Or do you just try and have a look at all of it?
Okay, well, we have to divide it into two parts here. First is my professional obligations. So they may have me on panels. I've been giving keynote speeches from time to time. I've been guest of honor. So that comes with certain obligations. At San Diego, I've been a presenter at the Eisner Awards. I've done book signings, autograph sessions. I have introduced movies and documentaries that we've done. So all of that goes first into my schedule, and I have to give priority to that. Once those things are set, then what I want to do is I want to hobnob with my fellow wizards. I want to see as many of my friends and pals over the years from the comic book industry, the movie industry, the TV industry. Everybody kind of gets together at San Diego. At night, there's usually 3 or 4 parties per night, and we kind of do the party circuit, trying to show up and at least make an appearance at everybody's gatherings. So that's part of it, the socialization. Beyond that, I want to mingle with the fans. I'm the kind of producer that I typically do not go to screenings. I do not go to private screenings. I go to movie theaters with mass audiences, and I'll sit in the middle of the movie theater with everybody, and that's the only way I can understand what the audiences are interested in, what they're reacting to, and I'll walk out with them and listen to what the buzz is, because it's a producer's responsibility to be in touch with the tastes of the public.
Sure.
And if you just go to private screenings, you can't be very good at that job after a while. So I love the mingling with the fans and talking to the fans as much as I can at these events. That's been a great thing. Even when I'm doing a signing, sometimes I drive the people crazy at the different booths because the fan wants to talk to me while I'm signing. I want to engage and have a give and take. I don't just want to scribble my name on something and have them walk away. So I really enjoy that part of it as well. And then I try to pick out panels that I can go to that I have the time slot available, and it's usually panels on the history of comics. I'm a history buff. I love the history. I'm a comic book historian, so I seek those out. I like to try to find panels with artists and writers who come from the eras of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Too often, these people are not given the proper attention they should be given. They are not given the honor they should be given, and I want to make sure that they all are recognized and all know how much we appreciate how much they contributed to our superheroes, to our art form, to the whole world of comics.
I can imagine that you're going to be, I can imagine, driving the initiative to get as many of those creators in San Diego and indeed the cons this year for Batman 75.
Batman 75 is important. This is now only the second character to have hit that milestone. In the next few years, you're going to have many: Captain Marvel, Archie, Captain America, then Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, the Justice Society / Justice League. It's going to be one after another that are going to be celebrated, and the next one coming up will be this fall, where Marvel Comics #1 will turn 75, and that's the issue that gave us the Human Torch and Submariner.
Yeah. Brilliant. So, obviously, San Diego Comic-Con is going to be a big year. I'm guessing are you going to WonderCon this year, or are you...
No, I cannot go to WonderCon this year because I have a previous contractual obligation. My son is going in my stead, so he is representing me there.
Excellent. So you will be making your way to San Diego Comic-Con, and
I'll be at San Diego. I will be at New York for sure.
Brilliant.
And beyond that, I'm going to be attending some of my first international Comic-Cons. I will be appearing at the first ever Thailand Comic-Con in Bangkok in early July. And there will be some announcements forthcoming about other international Comic-Cons because I really would like to get out to more international ones and meet the fans from all over the world. That's very important to me, and that's become a priority.
Sure. Well, I mean, that I think is reflecting on not only how San Diego has changed as a con, but how cons have changed. That these events are taking place worldwide. How do you feel? How has Comic-Con or Comic-Cons changed for you? Obviously, apart from the size and the exposure worldwide, how do you feel cons have changed? Certainly in terms of embracing other media, perhaps.
Well, I am a little bit chagrined that Comic-Cons today, it's probably a misnomer. A lot of them should be pop culture cons.
Sure.
And I'm a little bit chagrined that some that are labeled as Comic-Cons devote more and more and more attention to other things. And what hurts will be if I walk through a Comic-Con someplace and I see the comic book dealers and the original comic book art dealers and the comic book writers and artists who are doing their autographs relegated to a small area or to a back area. I think it's really important that the focus still remain, somewhat at least, on comic books and the people behind the comic books.
Well, I think that's
really important.
I think that's what's really special about San Diego, in that the Artist Alley section of the con is so big. It does represent and recognise comic, not only just the big two, but also the strong independent spirit of new emerging talent. I'm very much pleased to see Artist Alley as big as it is, and also when you look through the schedule, you see so many panels devoted to comics and comic history. I find that very I find that reassuring about
It
Comic
is.
Cons.
You know, you never want to sell your soul to Hollywood. You want your soul to be the comics, not the Hollywood stuff. Because once you get to that, you get into a tail wagging the dog situation. And I would give a special shout out to New York Comic Con at the Javits Center, which, you know, really goes out of its way to really maintain a focus on comics, and that's much appreciated. And you hit another great point on Artist Alley. You can go to Artist Alley in San Diego and New York and all these other cons, even the smaller ones, and you can see still out there Al Bellman, who's about to turn 90. Al is the last surviving Marvel artist from the golden age of comics. He drew Captain America, the Patriot, Submariner, and the Torch. And he's the last one standing. And there he is, doing commissions, signing, drawing for people. It's incredible. And then you go to the booth right next to him, and it's a young man who's maybe 19 or 20 years old who's just emerging in the alternative press and the independent press as a hot new rock star to be in the world of comics. So the fact that Artist Alley gives attention to both eras as well as who's hot in the mainstream right now, that's a really great thing.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I think I'm going to wrap up with just one last question that has been submitted by Neil Williamson, and I think we'll close on this. And it's a personal question for yourself, in that, and you talked about that Comic-Con should very much embrace and continue to embrace comic books, and that Hollywood, it shouldn't dominate too much. However, is there a comic book storyline from any character that you would still like to see brought to life on the big screen?
Many. Everyone I loved as a kid. I mean, I could go through and name you a bunch that were my favorites when I was growing up, and I would love to see all of them come to fruition. I was a huge fan of Doc Savage and The Shadow. I was a huge fan of Thunder Agents, the Wally Wood creation that was just incredible, that involved Steve Ditko, the co-creator of Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, and so many other wonderful legendary artists. I'd always loved DC, the Spectre and Hawkman, and it was just wonderful, wonderful characters. Marvel, I was a huge fan of Doctor Strange. Can't wait for a Doctor Strange movie. There's still a lot of great characters that I'd like to see brought to the silver screen, and one in particular, and this goes back to my days of being mentored by Otto Binder, my days of my correspondence through junior high school and high school with C.C. Beck, and that's Captain Marvel, whom some people today know as Shazam.
Well, yes. Well, I mean, you mentioned two there. I mean, obviously, referenced in the recent Captain America film was Doctor Strange, so there's still hope for that one. But also, Doc Savage is getting a new book, so hopefully that character will once again get some traction and some popularity from the general readership. So you never know. You never know. It's more than likely. You can only hope.
You can only hope. And Leonard, stay tuned for an announcement about that, which I hope will be forthcoming before much longer.
Okay. All right. That sounds like a little bit of an exclusive. I can live with that. That's fantastic. Michael, thank you very much indeed for your time. I really look forward to seeing you at San Diego in July. And thank you very much indeed for taking part in this conversation.
I am so happy to have done it. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks to all the fans, all your listeners. I really enjoyed this.
Excellent. And we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.